Welcome back to another 2 Minute Tuesday, and we're going to go back to trying a Shelfer edition, Zero or Hero. It's going to be Russell's 10. This is really easy to find, and typically is anywhere between about $35 and $40 before taxes. I know in Washington State, these are typically about $40 plus our taxes. I'm a big fan of Russell's products. That should probably be obvious by some of the stuff over my shoulder here. Russell's picks are some of my favorite things to buy, but those are single barrels. So the question is the base level Russell's 10 able to compete against some of the bigger whiskeys that are out there that are age stated at 10 years? So something like Henry McKenna 10, Eagle Rare, Jack Daniel's 10, the Old Forester 1924, probably not Michter's 10, let's be fair. That's getting into a kind of different stratosphere as far as price is concerned, but anywhere between a similar price to this, something like Eagle Rare, which is typically, I think they're now like $42 or something like that before tax in Washington. The McKennas are usually anywhere between about $55 and $60 pre-tax, although some stores charge a lot more. And then things like Jack Daniel's, which ends up closer to about that, like $80 plus tax, $100 or so. I think it's like $115, I think, is the MSRP for the Old Forester. We're going to first start with our 2 Minute Tuesday doing notes on Russell's Reserve 10, this baseline commonly available shelfer. Is it a zero or is it a hero? And then we'll do a comparison against some of the other 10-year age-stated competitors that are out on the market that are anywhere between relatively available and somewhat hard to find. I would say somewhat hard to find being the Jack and the 1924, Eagle Rare and Henry McKenna, reasonably findable. I know certain states you can't get Eagle Rare, it's nigh impossible, but states like mine, it's fairly readily available. It's just kind of in waves. So like it'll be around for a month or so, then it goes away for a couple months, and it's around for a month or so, and you can find quite a bit of it. So let's get into it. Let's see, how does Russell's 10 hold up to our challenge of 2 Minute Tuesday? Color right away. Nice, pretty typical bourbon color. That 10 years is really showing. Got a little bit of leg going on to it. The nose, this is classic in the sense of like what I get out of turkey. There's a touch of cherry, definitely some oak influence from that 10 years, and there is this little funkiness. People who've been drinking any wild turkey product for a period of time will always kind of call it a turkey funk. It's especially prevalent on the palate, but it's definitely here in the Russells. Classic kind of wild turkey bourbon. There's nothing crazy going on. It's nothing insane. It's all kind of a normal bourbon profile. Let's go to the palate. Oh yeah. That's what I remember. Obviously, like, had a few of these. Being 90 proof, it doesn't really light your palate up really fast, but you do get a lot of just classic bourbon flavor going on here. There's a little sweetness that is kind of that caramel thing going on from your wood sugars. There's definitely influence of the oak. Has a 10-year product, but it's in that more sweet. It's not very tannic. It's not any of the bitterness that's sometimes come out of oak. It's definitely more a little bit of the sweetness. There is a like really faint bit of cherry that's in there. On the back, as it starts getting past the initial part of the sweetness up front and gets into the mid and finish portions of the palate, if you're familiar with like the turkey funk, right? That's where that really comes in. It's kind of similar to like if you've ever had like a really funky leader. There's just something that's kind of a little dusty, a little different, a little funky that's interesting and adds a little kick to the end of the profile. It definitely has a decent linger despite being 90 proof. It's certainly not going to kick in at some of the higher level stuff. I mean, it's not sitting here for minutes on my palate. You can still feel it for a little while. You know, it's a good like 20 seconds or so after taking a sip. I can still feel it in there in the finish. It's not super peppery. It's just kind of nice and light and warm. There's like a touch of what gets close to kind of a nutty profile, and I would say that's more just the wood influence, almost to the point of where it becomes kind of nutty. And I'm not talking like Jim Beam peanuts. I'm just talking kind of like a little almond butter kind of thing going on. Let's get to an overall score. Maybe a little biased in when I say this, but I would give this a solid 70. We're not talking about anything crazy here, right? This is a shelf whiskey at 10 years, but it's got all the hallmarks of wild turkey and the Russell's line in general that I like. There's that little bit of sweetness, that little bit of oak influence, touch, just a tiny bit of cherry that's coming in, but it's not like a complete fireball in your mouth. I mean, granted, it's only 90 proof, but it's not sitting there and like really burning you kind of cinnamony. It's that age has helped mellow it, make it nice and relaxed to where you get to enjoy it, but there's still just enough complexity that you're getting more than like a singular flavor out of the whiskey. And for me, that's really great. But unlike some of the great whiskey that's out there, this is not punching so high above its caliber that you would start looking into something that takes you into like the 80s or even the 90s, right? Now, granted, some people might say, well, I'd go Wild Turkey 101 instead. And I can understand that, but I tend to prefer the age-stated portion of this because of the influence that it gives me in that extra age. How does this compare to some of these guys? Let's do a quick sip. I'm going to start Well, the McKenna 10. Now, McKenna saw a huge spike in popularity and price, unfortunately, during the pandemic because it had won a number of awards, and that all of a sudden spiked the interest in it, and Heaven Hill hadn't quite caught up in the amount of production. Real quick on the nose, there's a distinct difference in the profiles here. This is definitely a Heaven Hill product. It's got a nice... Heaven Hill typically has a, like, really specific kind of nutty note to me, and it is very... more like almondy and not peanutty like, say, Jim Beam would be. Beyond that, you can still definitely get some influence from the oak and stuff. Let's do a little sip, compare that real fast. Yeah, the McKenna is good. I don't want to take away from that, and especially as it's coming back down from some of those crazy pricing. For a while in Washington, you could not find a McKenna 10 in like a mom and pop store for less than $80 plus tax, which I always thought was nuts. Because it used to be a significantly cheaper bottle, and now I think it's somewhere in the like 55 to 60 range plus tax, which I think is fair. It's fair enough, right? And if I were to compare this directly to the Russells, the palate, it doesn't have that fruity, that little touch of cherry. There is a little bit of sweetness, but it's less caramel and more of a kind of brown sugary kind of thing going on. There's a lot more what I would consider the oak influence going on, and a little bit more kind of pepper on the back end, and that nuttiness that I talked about is definitely there in the palate. It's way more than, say, that tiny barely on the note, barely showing up nutty thing that was going on in the Russells. Is this worth the extra, let's just say $20 plus tax? I don't think this would be the one that I would regularly go to. I like the McKenna. I even have like backups of it because I like just having one in general around. But for the price difference, I would argue this is a profile I like more, the Russells. Now let's go to probably the most popular 10-year age stated out there, Eagle Rare. Some people might complain because it can be very hard to find Eagle Rare for some folks. Out here, Eagle Rare is actually pretty easy to find. I've got a buddy who this is his like go-to warm-up pour. That's how commonly he can find it. Man, one thing about Buffalo Trace products in general always have this wonderful fruitiness that's going on, and the Eagle Rare is no slouch there. It's a way fruitier and definitely far sweeter on the nose than the Russells is. Now, like the Russells, this is also at 90 proof. It's significantly sweeter on the palate. There's a lot more kind of the wood sugar influence, and definitely that fruity stuff that's going on. A lot of, honestly, mostly kind of cherry and a little more brighter cherry. You know how it is. You get some kind of medicinal cherries, you get some darker cherries, and there's kind of some bright, almost like maraschino style cherries. That's what's definitely going on here. One thing that's missing though is I don't feel it here nearly as long as I do with the Russells, and so that's where I would kind of take it back a little bit. I would say that in general, this is probably the more sought after bottle, the Eagle Rare, but I think it depends on your personal palate. If you prefer sweeter, more fruity whiskeys, you're probably going to want to go find the Eagle Rare where possible. If you want something that's got a little tamer sweet level, but still has some kind of interesting going on, or maybe you really find yourself interested in like the turkey funk, then that's where I would go to the Russells. And I would say between the two of these, I think they're a deadpan. It just depends on whether I want the sweeter whiskey or the less sweet whiskey on the particular time when I'm taking a pour. To me, they're about dead even head to head. Now we're going to start getting into a lot harder to find stuff with Jack Daniel's 10-year. This one happens to be batch 2, so not this year's and also not last year's, but this was the second batch of Jack Daniel's 10. I have tried the first 3 batches, the most recent batch, batch 4, along with the 12 and 15, just haven't made it to Washington yet, but let's see how these lesser or non-allocated whiskeys can handle something like this. It only comes out once a year and is fairly highly allocated. Dude. The nose right away, there's definitely a bit of banana and a lot of like more of the nut side of like say banana nut bread. And some people won't like that. I do a lot. Good Lord. So I'm in the camp. I don't know if you're in this camp, maybe you're in the opposite camp. I have found that I like the Jack Daniel's 10s more than the 12s. So that should probably tell you right away where we're looking at with this. The palate is so significantly different. There's a touch of banana, but there's a lot of like, I would also say like peanut brittle going on for me. It's very caramely. There's a lot of like kind of nutty flavors that are going in there. There's a touch of banana that's in there, but it's just like, it's wonderful. It's 97 proof? Yeah, 97 proof. So it lingers a little bit longer. There's not a huge influence from the barrel spice going on in this, but it's definitely has a reasonable linger. It sits in there, kind of lights your palate up a little bit. The question is like, is it worth hunting down the Jack Daniels compared to something that is easily available on the shelf? Does the Russell's actually compete? This one's a no. I admit that this is very hard to find, and I've only had so much of the Jack 10 personally, but it's just the difference in price also should be noted. This is like an $80 bottle plus taxes, and it's worth it. It really does shine in comparison to just being a significantly more complex whiskey. Is it so different that it's not even worth considering the Russell's? And that's where I would say no. Where I would put this as something like 76, 77, not super high in the grand scheme of things, but it is just quite a bit more complex. There's a bit more flavor going on there, and it is, despite being slightly higher proof, it drinks nice and relaxed, just like the 90 proofers are. It's not something that's losing points anywhere other than the allocation and price. Now, if you can't find Jack at all, I would still say Russell's 10 would be a worthwhile pickup because you're getting some really interesting flavor. But if you have the opportunity to get a Jack Daniel's fairly close to MSRP, this would be the one I would try to have. Finally, we'll do a really fast comparison to the Old Forester 1924. Let's be fair. This is about triple the cost of a Russell's 10-year. And relatively allocated and hard to find. So you've got kind of the combo of much higher price and a pain to find. So now we'll ask the question is, how well does the Russell stand up? This is also 100 proof, should be worth noting, and on the nose right away. This is probably the best nose of the three. 4. That extra proof is definitely helping push some of the aromatics through and might affect our palate too, but there's a lot of like deeper wood sugar going on here. There's also a little bit of like prune, which I know it sounds weird, but maybe you might think it's like more raisiny, depends on you, but it has a very like deeper kind of stewed or dried fruit thing going on, and not something brighter like a citrus fruit or kind of like your red berries and things like that. On the palate, very similar to the nose. There's a lot of oak influence, significant kind of brown, sugary, almost binging on molasses kind of sweetness. And unlike some of our other ones, the fruit note is not bright at all. It's a very dark fruit, and I honestly think prune is the closest I would get to this, and some people might immediately be turned off by that thought. It might come forward as more of raisiny to some other people, but it kind of reminds me a little of prunes, and that's not a bad thing. It's different than a lot of other whiskeys, and that can be positive, but the question is this better than the Russell's? No. Not on the palate. I honestly don't think this is better than the Russell's or the Eagle Rare on the palate. I think on the nose it is. It has a better nose than it does palate. The aromatics are just a lot better than how it shows up on the palate. It lingers a lot longer. There's a nice little kind of barrel spice going on as it gets into the finish, and that's an improvement compared to some of the lower proof ones, like most of these, including the Russell's. But I don't think its flavor profile is better than the Russell's or the Jack or the Eagle Rare. I would probably rather have those, especially when you consider that compared to Eagle Rare and our good friend Russell's in case here, it's triple the MSRP. Would I rather have one Old Forester 1924, or would I rather have 3 Russell's or a couple Russell's and an Eagle Rare, right? Something like that. Or even, I mean, realistically, you could get a Russell's and a Jack 10, and I would rather have those combinations of bottles instead. So there you go. Go back to it one more time just in case. Yeah, I'd rather have the Russell's. Tastes better. That's my palate. So, there you go. Russell's 10, a standout. Now, granted, I have a little bias. Love the Russell's line in general. I would say for a shelf whiskey that's available, batting a solid 70 is a positive, and this is a shelf hero. This is one of those ones that I think if you're kind of get a whiskey collection going and you want to get familiar with certain profiles, Russell's is one of the ones that I would get a hold of to try and get an idea of whether or not you want to chase some of these more allocated Russell's products. Similar to how you might get regular Buffalo Trace or something like that to go and get an idea of how a lot of the Buffalo Trace lines are. So that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Are you a Russell's 10 fan? Do you have Russell's 10 lying around? Do you always have it on the shelf? Did you try it once and never like it ever again? Let me know in the comments down below. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like. Maybe consider sharing. It's one of the best ways to help us small whiskey tubers grow. If you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. It's one of the best ways to keep up. I'll be doing a few extra things here coming soon, not just the 2 Minute Tuesday reviews, but we're going to start doing some extra stuff, and it's going to get a lot of fun. As always, my friends, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.